What would you do if you discovered your husband had buried 4 wives before you in the backyard? Would you run? Would you call police? Would you dig them up yourself? Well, when I found that shovel covered in dried blood, I chose a different option. I decided to give him exactly what he'd given them. My name is Betty Morrison, and I'm 83 years old now. Everyone in Cedar Falls knows me as the quiet widow who sells jam at the farmer's market and keeps her garden prettier than a picture postcard. They see this old woman with silver hair and think they know my whole story. But honey, what they don't know is that I survived something that would have broken most people. And more importantly, I made sure the monster who tried to break me never got the chance to hurt anyone else. It all started 64 years ago when I was just 19 and desperate enough to make the worst decision of my life. My mama had died that winter, and daddy had been gone since I was 12, leaving me with nothing but debt and a reputation that made decent folks cross the street when they saw me coming. You see, in a town like Cedar Falls in 1960, being poor was one thing, but being poor and pretty with no family to protect you was quite another. That's when Cornelius Morrison came calling. He was 57 years old, owned the biggest house on Elm Street, and had more money than anyone in 3 counties. When he asked my landlord about the young woman living in the boarding house who was behind on her rent, Mrs. Patterson practically shoved me into his path like I was a prize heifer at auction. Cornelius was everything a desperate girl was supposed to want. Distinguished silver hair, expensive suits, and a way of speaking that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. He courted me for exactly 3 weeks, bringing flowers and candy, taking me to the nicest restaurant in town where everyone could see us together. He told me I was beautiful, that I deserved better than the life I was living, that he wanted to take care of me forever. I should have questioned why a man like that would want a girl like me. Should have wondered why he was in such a hurry to marry someone he barely knew. Should have asked more about the other wives people mentioned in whispers, the ones who had died so young and so mysteriously. But when you're 19 and hungry and tired of being alone, you don't ask the questions that might take away your only chance at salvation. We were married on a Tuesday morning in March, just the 2 of us and the justice of the peace. Cornelius said he didn't believe in big weddings, that they were wasteful displays for shallow people. I thought it was romantic, this quiet ceremony that was just about our love. I didn't realize until much later that small weddings leave fewer witnesses, fewer people to remember details if questions ever get asked. The house on Elm Street was everything I had dreamed of and more. 3 stories of Victorian elegance with rooms bigger than the entire boarding house where I'd been living. Cornelius showed me through it like a tour guide, pointing out the library where his first wife used to read, the music room where his second wife played piano, the garden where his third wife grew her roses, and the sunroom where his fourth wife painted watercolors. The way he talked about them, so casual and matter-of-fact, should have chilled my blood, but I was 19 and in love with the idea of being loved, and I convinced myself that his openness about his past meant he had nothing to hide. He told me they had all died of natural causes, consumption, heart failure, a tragic accident, and a sudden fever. Such terrible luck for one man to lose so many wives. But life was harder in those days, and women died young more often than not. The first few weeks of marriage were like living in a fairy tale. Cornelius showered me with gifts, beautiful dresses and jewelry that made me feel like a princess. He hired a housekeeper so I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a large house, and he encouraged me to spend my days reading in the library or walking in the garden. He said he wanted his young wife to be happy and carefree, that I'd had enough hardship in my short life. But slowly, things began to change. The gifts became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The housekeeper was dismissed without explanation. Cornelius began expecting me to manage the household alone, cooking elaborate meals and keeping the house spotless. When I struggled with tasks I'd never learned to do properly, he would sigh with disappointment and make comments about how his other wives had been so much more capable. The comparisons started subtle and then grew more cutting. His first wife had been such an accomplished seamstress, she could make a dress that looked like it came from Paris. His second wife had been a wonderful cook who never served him the same meal twice in a month. His third wife had kept the most beautiful garden, with roses that won prizes at the county fair. His fourth wife had been so artistic, her paintings were the envy of every woman in town. And what was I? A young woman with no skills, no accomplishments, no talents worth mentioning. I should be grateful, he told me, that he had rescued me from poverty and given me a life of luxury. The least I could do was try to live up to the standards set by the women who had come before me. The house began to feel less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to his previous wives. Their belongings were everywhere. Dresses still hanging in closets, books with their names written inside, paintings on the walls, gardens still arranged according to their designs. I felt like I was living in a shrine to dead women, constantly being measured against ghosts I could never hope to match. But it was the basement that changed everything. Cornelius had told me it was just storage, nothing down there that would interest me. He kept it locked and said the stairs were too dangerous for a young woman to navigate alone. But one afternoon in late summer, when he was in town on business, I found the key hidden behind a loose brick in the kitchen wall. What I discovered in that basement would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It wasn't storage, it was a workshop, but not the kind where men built furniture or fixed broken tools. This was a place where someone prepared bodies for burial. There were metal tables stained with what could only be blood, tools that belonged in a morgue, and chemicals whose sharp smell made my eyes water and my stomach turn. But what made my knees give out completely were the photographs. Dozens of them, arranged in neat albums like some twisted family collection. Pictures of his wives, not wedding portraits or happy family moments, but images of them sick, suffering, dying. I saw the progression of their decline, the way they had wasted away, the fear in their eyes as they realized what was happening to them. And there, at the very back of the last album, were empty pages waiting to be filled. Pages with my name already written at the top in Cornelius's careful handwriting. Betty Morrison, wife number 5. The pages where my own death would be documented, photographed, and preserved for his sick pleasure. That's when I understood that my fairy tale marriage had been a death sentence from the very first day. Cornelius Morrison wasn't a lonely widower looking for companionship. He was a collector who specialized in young wives, and I was simply his latest acquisition, waiting my turn to join the others in whatever horrible end he had planned. But here's what Cornelius didn't know about the desperate 19-year-old girl he had married. I might have been poor and uneducated, but I had learned a few things about survival living on my own since I was 12 years old, and I had no intention of becoming photograph number 5 in his collection of dead wives. The most shocking discovery was yet to come. As I stood in that basement, surrounded by evidence of systematic murder, my hands shaking as I turned page after page of horrific photographs, I began to understand the true scope of what I had stumbled into. This wasn't just about 4 dead wives. This was about a monster who had perfected his technique over decades, and I was looking at the workshop where he had refined his methods. Each album was labeled with dates and names, documenting not just the deaths, but the entire process that led to them. I saw pictures of healthy young women on their wedding days, radiant with hope and happiness. Then came images of the same women months later, confused and sickly, their eyes hollow with pain and fear. The final photographs in each album showed them in their death throes, captured with the cold precision of someone documenting an experiment. But what made my blood run cold were the detailed notes written in Cornelius's neat handwriting beneath each photograph. Clinical observations about symptoms, dosages, timing, and effects. This wasn't just murder, it was systematic poisoning, carefully calibrated to appear like natural illness while actually being completely controlled by the man these women trusted most in the world. Wife number 1, Margaret, had been given small doses of arsenic mixed into her morning tea over the course of 6 months. The notes described how her hair fell out, how her skin grew pale and clammy, how she complained of stomach pains that the local doctor couldn't diagnose. The final entry simply read, "Subject expired after experiencing full symptoms. Method effective but timeline too extended. Adjust for future applications." Wife number 2, Catherine, had been the test case for a more efficient approach. Cornelius had used a combination of digitalis and strychnine, compounds that could mimic heart failure when administered correctly. The timeline had been reduced to 4 months, and the notes showed his satisfaction with the improvement. Symptoms more convincing to medical professionals. Death appeared completely natural. Recommend this method for future subjects. Wife number 3, Dorothy, had suffered through what the notes called the perfected formula, a cocktail of plant-based poisons that produced symptoms resembling consumption, complete with the characteristic wasting away and bloody cough. The doctor had been completely fooled, even commenting to neighbors about how tragic it was for such a young woman to succumb to such a common but deadly disease. Wife number 4, Rose, had been his most recent victim, and her album showed the culmination of all his previous experiments. The poisoning had been so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that even she hadn't realized what was happening until it was far too late. The final photographs showed her on her deathbed, still believing her husband was caring for her while he was actually documenting her final moments for his collection. But it was the fifth album, the one with my name on it, that truly terrified me. Because it wasn't empty. Cornelius had already begun documenting my life as his wife, had already started taking photographs when I wasn't aware. Pictures of me sleeping, pictures of me eating meals he had prepared, pictures of me in various states of undress when I thought I was alone in our bedroom. And beneath the photographs were notes about my daily routine, my habits, my preferences. He had been studying me like a laboratory specimen, recording everything he needed to know to begin my poisoning. The timeline he had written showed that I was currently in week 16 of what he called the conditioning phase, and that active treatment was scheduled to begin in just 2 more weeks. I realized with horror that I had already been ingesting his poisons for months without knowing it. The occasional stomach aches I had attributed to stress. The fatigue I thought was just from adjusting to married life. The headaches that came and went without explanation. All of it had been carefully orchestrated by the man who slept beside me every night. But what shook me to my core was discovering that I wasn't his first attempt at a fifth wife. There was another album, one labeled Failed Subject, Sarah, age 17. The photographs showed a girl even younger than me, a girl who had somehow figured out what Cornelius was doing before he could complete his work. The final images showed her running from the house, and the last note simply said, "Subject escaped before termination, claimed accidental overdose to authorities, no charges filed due to lack of evidence. Recommend more careful selection in future." Sarah had gotten away. Somehow, a 17-year-old girl had outwitted Cornelius Morrison and lived to tell about it. If she could do it, maybe I could too. But I also realized that her escape was probably why he had chosen me next. He wanted someone older, someone more desperate, someone who would be less likely to question his methods or run away when things got difficult. As I carefully put everything back exactly as I had found it, my mind was racing with plans and possibilities. I couldn't go to the police. Cornelius was too respected in the community, too wealthy, too well-connected. Who would believe a poor girl's word against one of the town's most distinguished citizens? And Sarah had already tried that approach with no success. I couldn't run away either. I had no money, no family, nowhere to go. And even if I managed to escape, Cornelius would just find another victim, another desperate young woman to add to his collection. The cycle would continue, and more women would die because I hadn't been brave enough to stop him. But I had one advantage that his previous wives hadn't possessed. I knew what he was planning before he had really begun. I was still healthy, still strong, still able to think clearly. If I was careful, if I was smart, if I was willing to do what needed to be done, I might be able to turn his own methods against him. That night at dinner, I watched Cornelius differently. I noticed how he served my plate himself, how he always made sure I finished everything he gave me. I observed the way he watched me eat, making mental notes about my reactions to the food. I saw him studying my face for signs of the symptoms he was expecting to see, symptoms that would tell him his poisons were beginning to work. "You seem distracted tonight, my dear," he said, his voice carrying that false warmth I now recognized as completely artificial. "Are you feeling quite well?" "Just a little tired," I replied, playing the role of the innocent wife who had no idea what was happening to her. "I think I might be coming down with something." I saw the flash of satisfaction in his eyes, the barely concealed pleasure at hearing me describe exactly the kind of vague symptoms his poisoning was designed to produce. "Perhaps you should rest more," he suggested. "I could bring your meals upstairs so you don't have to exert yourself unnecessarily." The offer was presented as kindness, but I understood it for what it really was. He wanted me isolated, dependent on him for everything I consumed, unable to observe his preparations or question his methods. It was the same pattern he had followed with all his previous wives, the same trap that had led 4 women to their deaths. But this time, things were going to be different. Because while Cornelius Morrison thought he was dealing with another naive victim, what he had actually married was a woman who now knew exactly what kind of monster he was. And I had no intention of becoming victim number 5. The real game was just beginning. The weeks that followed my basement discovery were the most terrifying and dangerous of my life. I had to pretend to be the same trusting young wife while secretly staying alert to every detail of Cornelius's behavior. I had to eat the food he prepared, knowing it might contain poison, while appearing grateful for his care. Most challenging of all, I had to begin planning my counterattack without giving him any reason to suspect I knew the truth. I started by doing research in the town library whenever Cornelius was occupied with his business affairs. I told him I was reading novels to pass the time, but I was actually studying everything I could find about poisons, their symptoms, and their antidotes. What I learned was both helpful and terrifying. Cornelius had been using compounds that were readily available to someone with his resources and knowledge. Arsenic could be purchased as rat poison. Digitalis came from foxglove plants that grew wild in many gardens, and strychnine was commonly used for pest control. The genius of his method was that all these substances, when used in small doses over time, produced symptoms that 19th century medicine attributed to common illnesses. But I also discovered that there were ways to protect myself. Certain foods could slow the absorption of poisons. Others could help the body eliminate toxins more quickly. I began to secretly modify my diet, eating raw eggs and milk when Cornelius wasn't watching, consuming large quantities of bread and other binding foods that would absorb whatever he was putting in my meals. More importantly, I learned that most of the poisons he favored had one critical weakness: they required consistent dosing to be lethal. If I could avoid consuming enough of whatever he was giving me, I might be able to maintain my health while appearing to decline according to his expectations. This meant I had to become an actress worthy of the stage. I began to complain of mild stomach upset, occasional headaches, and growing fatigue. I made sure to mention these symptoms when Cornelius was around, watching his face light up with satisfaction as he recorded my decline in whatever journal he kept hidden away. But what I needed most was evidence that would convince the authorities, something so damning that even Cornelius's reputation and wealth couldn't protect him. The photographs in the basement were horrific, but they were also in his private space where I had no legal right to be. I needed to catch him in the act, document his methods in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That's when I remembered Sarah, the girl who had escaped. If she was still alive, still in the area, she might be willing to help me gather the proof I needed. It took weeks of careful searching, asking casual questions around town, checking records at the courthouse when I claimed to be researching genealogy for a family project I was working on. I finally found her working as a seamstress in the next town over, living under her married name with a husband who clearly adored her. When I approached her explaining who I was and why I needed her help, the terror in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about what she had survived in Cornelius's house. I tried to tell people, Sarah whispered as we sat in the back corner of a small cafe where no one would recognize us. I went to the sheriff, I talked to the doctor, I even tried to tell the minister, but Cornelius had been grieving his poor dead wife so publicly, everyone thought I was a disturbed girl making up stories for attention. Sarah told me about the months she had spent in that house, how Cornelius had gradually isolated her from the outside world, how he had begun poisoning her so slowly that she almost didn't realize what was happening until it was nearly too late. "It was the roses that saved me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was working in the garden, trying to tend the plants like he wanted me to, when I noticed something strange about the soil around his wife's rose bushes. It was too rich, too dark, and it smelled wrong. When I dug a little deeper, I found pieces of fabric, hair ribbons, things that should have been buried with bodies but weren't." Sarah had realized that Cornelius wasn't just killing his wives. He was disposing of their bodies in the garden, using them as fertilizer for the plants that everyone admired. The beautiful roses that neighbors praised were literally growing from the decomposed remains of murdered women. "That's when I knew I had to run," she continued. "But I also knew that if I just disappeared, he'd find another girl and do the same thing to her. So I took some of his poison, just enough to make myself sick but not enough to die, and I made sure people saw me collapse. When the doctor examined me, he found traces of the compounds in my system. But even with physical evidence of poisoning, the authorities had been reluctant to pursue charges against such a prominent citizen. Cornelius had claimed that Sarah must have accidentally ingested the substances while helping him with pest control around the house. The case was quietly dropped, and Sarah was encouraged to leave town for her own well-being. "I've been waiting 4 years for someone else to figure out what he is," Sarah told me, tears streaming down her face. "I've been watching the newspapers, waiting to see if another wife died, hoping someone smarter than me would be able to stop him." Together, we began to plan a trap that would give us the evidence we needed to bring Cornelius to justice. Sarah still had contacts in town who could help, people who had believed her story even when the authorities wouldn't act on it. Most importantly, she had kept detailed records of everything that had happened to her, including samples of food and drink that she had managed to save before escaping. The plan we developed was dangerous and required precise timing. I would have to let Cornelius believe his poisoning was working while secretly documenting everything. Sarah would gather witnesses and prepare to present evidence at the right moment. And when we finally moved against him, it would have to be in a way that left him no room to escape or explain away his crimes. But as we sat there making our plans, I realized that Cornelius had probably already moved to the active phase of his timeline. The stomach pains I was experiencing were getting worse, the headaches more frequent. Even with my careful precautions, enough poison was getting into my system to cause real damage. I was literally racing against time, trying to gather evidence before whatever he was giving me caused permanent harm or death. And if I made even one mistake, if he suspected that I knew what he was doing, Cornelius would probably abandon his careful timeline and finish me off quickly. But I had something his previous wives hadn't possessed. I had an ally who understood his methods. I had knowledge of what he was planning, and I had the burning determination to make sure no other woman would ever suffer what we had endured. The most dangerous part of the plan was still to come. 3 months after discovering Cornelius's basement workshop, I was ready to spring the trap that would either save my life or end it. By then, the effects of his poisoning were becoming harder to hide even with my careful countermeasures. I was genuinely losing weight, my hands had developed a slight tremor, and I could see Cornelius's satisfaction growing as he watched me decline according to his predicted schedule. But what he didn't know was that every symptom he observed was being carefully documented by Sarah and her network of allies. They had been watching the house, photographing his comings and goings and recording his purchases of various compounds from different suppliers around the region. We had built a case that even his wealth and reputation wouldn't be able to dismiss. The confrontation began on a Tuesday evening in November, exactly 6 months after our wedding. Cornelius had prepared what I now knew would be my final meal, a dinner laced with a lethal dose of his favorite poison cocktail. The timeline in his journal had indicated that this would be the night I would succumb to the mysterious illness that had been slowly consuming me. I sat at the dining room table, looking at the beautifully presented plate he had prepared with such care, knowing that it contained enough poison to kill me within hours. Cornelius watched me with barely concealed anticipation, probably already planning how he would discover my body in the morning and summon the doctor to confirm another tragic loss. "You seem particularly pale tonight, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Perhaps you should eat something to restore your strength." "I've been thinking about your other wives," I replied quietly, not touching the food, "about how they all died so young, so mysteriously." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, caution, maybe the first hint that this conversation wasn't going according to his plan. "They were delicate creatures," he said carefully. "Illness took them before their time, sadly." "Is that what you call it?" I asked, pushing the plate away from me. "Illness?" The mask of concern dropped from his features completely. For the first time since I had married him, I was seeing the real Cornelius Morrison, cold, calculating, and completely without human feeling. "I think you've been reading too many novels, Betty," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Your imagination seems to be getting the better of you." "I went down to the basement, Cornelius," I said quietly. "I found your workshop. I saw the photographs. I read your notes." The silence that followed was deafening. Cornelius sat perfectly still, studying my face as if he was trying to solve a complex puzzle. Then slowly he began to smile. "Did you really think you were clever enough to outsmart me?" he asked, his voice now completely devoid of any pretense of warmth. "A poor, uneducated girl like you?" He stood up from his chair and moved toward a locked cabinet I had never seen him open before. From it, he withdrew a small bottle filled with clear liquid and a syringe that looked like it belonged in a doctor's office. "Your investigation skills are admirable," he continued, filling the syringe with practiced efficiency, "but ultimately pointless. You've simply moved up my timeline. Instead of a peaceful death in your sleep, you'll experience something a bit more immediate." That's when I played my final card. "The sheriff is already on his way, Cornelius. So are the federal marshals, and the newspaper reporter who's been investigating the suspicious deaths of young women in towns across 3 states. I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes for the first time. "You're lying." "Sarah Martinez sends her regards," I said, watching his face go pale at the mention of his escaped victim. "She's been very helpful in connecting your methods to similar cases in other locations. It seems you're not nearly as careful as you thought you were." The sound of horses' hooves and carriage wheels in the front drive confirmed what I was telling him. Cornelius moved to the window and saw what I had been hoping to see. Sheriff Palmer, 2 federal officers, and a small crowd of townspeople who had been carefully prepared for this moment. "You stupid little girl," he snarled, turning back to me with the syringe still in his hand. "Do you think they'll get here in time to save you?" But I was already moving, diving behind the heavy dining table as he lunged toward me with the poison-filled needle. What Cornelius didn't know was that while he had been teaching me to be a proper wife, I had been teaching myself to be a survivor. The desperate girl who had married him 6 months ago had learned a few tricks during her time in his house of horrors. The front door burst open just as Cornelius cornered me near the fireplace, and Sheriff Palmer entered with his weapon drawn. "Drop it, Morrison," he commanded. "We have witnesses and evidence. It's over." But Cornelius wasn't finished. In his arrogance, he seemed to believe he could still talk his way out of the situation. "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here," he said, his voice instantly transforming back to its usual cultured tones. "My poor wife has been having delusions, making wild accusations. I was simply trying to administer medicine to calm her nerves." That's when Sarah entered behind the sheriff, carrying a leather satchel that contained all the evidence we had gathered. "Hello, Cornelius," she said quietly. "I told you I would come back someday." The look of shock and rage on his face was worth every terrifying moment I had endured. "You," he whispered. "I should have made sure you were dead when I had the chance." "Like you made sure your wives were dead," Sarah replied. "Like you tried to make sure Betty was dead." She opened her satchel and began displaying the evidence we had collected. Photographs of his victims, samples of his poisons, testimonies from suppliers who had sold him suspicious compounds, and most damning of all, copies of pages from his own journals that she had managed to steal during her escape. The federal marshal stepped forward and placed Cornelius Morrison under arrest for the murders of 4 women and the attempted murder of 2 others. As they led him away in shackles, he looked back at me with pure hatred in his eyes. "You think you've won something here," he spat. "You'll never be free of what I've done to you. The poison is already in your system, already doing its work. You'll be dead within the month." But what Cornelius didn't know, what none of them knew except Sarah and the doctor we had secretly consulted, was that I had been taking antidotes for weeks. His final attempted poisoning hadn't worked because I had already neutralized most of the toxins in my system. I was going to survive, and more importantly, I was going to make sure that no other woman would ever fall into the trap that had nearly destroyed me. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come. The trial of Cornelius Morrison became the sensation of 1961, drawing reporters from newspapers across the region and filling the courthouse to capacity every day for 3 weeks. What had started as the case of a young wife making wild accusations against her respected husband had transformed into the exposure of one of the most systematic and calculated serial killers anyone had ever seen. Sarah and I testified for a combined total of 8 hours, describing in detail what we had endured in that house on Elm Street. But it was the physical evidence that truly convicted Cornelius. The basement workshop with its tools of torture, the albums full of death photographs, the detailed journals documenting his methods, and most damning of all, the chemical analysis of food samples that Sarah had preserved from her own poisoning. The prosecution brought in experts from the state university who explained how Cornelius's poison cocktails worked, how they mimicked natural illnesses, and how they had been specifically designed to avoid detection by the medical knowledge of the time. They showed that he had been purchasing the components from different suppliers across multiple states, using various names and addresses to avoid suspicion. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Dr. Edmund Hayes, a forensic investigator who had examined the garden behind Cornelius's house. Using new scientific methods, he had been able to determine that the soil contained traces of human remains, not just one body, but multiple bodies that had been buried and then disturbed, possibly to use the decomposed matter as fertilizer. The defendant, Dr. Hayes testified, had created what can only be described as a human composting operation. The bones, hair, and fabric fragments we discovered indicate that at least 4 bodies had been disposed of in this manner over a period of several years. The defense attorney, clearly struggling with an impossible case, tried to argue that Cornelius was a grieving widower who had simply been unlucky in love. He suggested that Sarah and I were disturbed young women who had conspired to frame an innocent man for our own attention or financial gain. But the evidence was overwhelming, and our testimonies were supported by too many independent witnesses and expert analyses to be dismissed. On the witness stand, Cornelius tried to maintain his dignity and respectability. He spoke eloquently about his love for his deceased wives, his efforts to care for them during their illnesses, and his shock at being accused of such horrible crimes. But when the prosecutor began questioning him about specific entries in his journals, his composure began to crack. "Can you explain this entry dated March 15th, 1960? The prosecutor asked, reading from one of the journals. "Subject showing expected symptoms. Increase dosage by half. Anticipate termination within 2 weeks." "What subject were you referring to, Mr. Morrison?" Those journals contained notes about pest control around my property," Cornelius stammered. "I was tracking the effectiveness of various treatments for garden insects. And this entry from June 3rd, photography session successful. Subject unaware of documentation. Final images will complete the collection. Were you photographing insects, Mr. Morrison?" As the questioning continued, Cornelius became increasingly agitated and defensive. Finally, in a moment that sealed his fate, he lost control completely. "You don't understand," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "These women were nothing before I found them. Poor, desperate, worthless creatures with no prospects and no futures. I gave them beautiful deaths, dignified endings to lives that would have been meaningless otherwise." The courtroom erupted at this confession, and the judge had to restore order with his gavel. But the damage was done. Cornelius Morrison had just admitted in open court that he viewed his wives as worthless creatures deserving of death, and that he had deliberately given them what he called beautiful deaths. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on all charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The judge sentenced Cornelius to death by hanging, a sentence that was carried out 6 months later in the state penitentiary. But for me, the real victory wasn't in seeing Cornelius punished for his crimes. It was in the changes that came afterward, the ways that our case helped protect other women from similar predators. The publicity surrounding the trial led to investigations of suspicious deaths in other states, resulting in the identification of at least 6 more cases where older men had married young women who died under mysterious circumstances. New laws were passed requiring more thorough investigations of sudden deaths among young wives, and medical schools began teaching doctors to recognize the signs of deliberate poisoning. Sarah and I became advocates for women's safety, speaking at churches and community gatherings about the warning signs of abusive marriages and predatory behavior. We helped establish a network of safe houses where women could go if they found themselves trapped in dangerous situations. Most importantly, we proved that even the most vulnerable women, poor girls with no family, no education, and no resources, could fight back against evil if they had the courage and determination to do so. The house on Elm Street was demolished after Cornelius's execution, and a small park was built on the site with a memorial garden dedicated to the women who had died there. Every spring, I visit that garden to tend the flowers and remember the wives who didn't survive long enough to see justice done. But I also go there to remind myself that I did survive, that I found the strength to fight back, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. The sweetest victory was still to come. 64 years have passed since I stood in that courtroom and watched Cornelius Morrison receive his death sentence. I'm 83 years old now, and most people in Cedar Falls have forgotten the scandal that once shook our quiet town to its core. But I remember everything, every detail of those terrifying months, every moment of fear and determination that led to my survival. The young woman who married Cornelius Morrison in desperation died in that basement the day she discovered his photographs. In her place emerged someone harder, wiser, and absolutely determined that no other woman would suffer what she had endured. That transformation saved not just my life, but the lives of countless other women who might have fallen into similar traps. After the trial, Sarah and I dedicated ourselves to creating a network of protection for vulnerable women. We established the Morrison Foundation, named not to honor my dead husband, but to ensure his victims would never be forgotten. The foundation provided resources for women escaping dangerous marriages, funded training for law enforcement officers to recognize signs of domestic poisoning, and supported medical research into detecting deliberate toxin exposure. Our work led to the identification and prosecution of 12 other men across 7 states who had used similar methods to murder their wives. The network we created helped save an estimated 43 women from situations that would likely have resulted in their deaths. Each case reinforced what I had learned during those dark months in predators count on their victims being isolated, ashamed, and convinced that no one will believe them. But the most important legacy of my survival wasn't the criminals we caught, or the laws we changed. It was the simple but powerful message we spread to women everywhere. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and never too poor, too young, or too powerless to fight for your life. I kept the house where Sarah had lived after her escape, turning it into a safe house for women fleeing dangerous situations. Over the decades, hundreds of women passed through those doors, finding shelter, support, and most importantly, the knowledge that they weren't alone in their struggles. Many of their stories reminded me of my own, young women who had married in desperation, only to discover they had wed monsters who saw them as disposable objects rather than human beings. Others had been trapped by family members, employers, or community leaders who used their positions of authority to exploit and abuse vulnerable women. Each woman who found safety in that house took a piece of my heart with her when she left to start her new life. But she also left something behind, proof that survival was possible, that evil could be defeated, and that even the most powerless person could find the strength to fight back when necessary. The medical antidotes that saved my life from Cornelius's final poisoning attempt became the foundation for treatments that are now standard in hospitals across the country. Dr. Hayes, the forensic investigator who had analyzed the soil in Cornelius's garden, went on to develop new techniques for detecting human remains that have helped solve hundreds of cold cases. Sarah lived to be 89, passing away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew her as a loving wife and mother, not as a survivor of attempted murder. Before she died, she made me promise to keep telling our story, to ensure that future generations would understand what we had learned about recognizing and stopping predators. The thing about evil, she told me during our final conversation, is that it counts on good people doing nothing. It thrives in silence and shame. But when we speak up, when we fight back, when we refuse to be victims, we take away its power. The roses that now grow in the memorial garden where Cornelius's house once stood are beautiful, but they grow from clean soil, nourished by hope rather than horror. I tend them myself when weather permits, and I tell the flowers about the women whose memory they honor, Margaret, Catherine, Dorothy, and Rose, who deserved so much better than the fate that befell them. Sometimes young women visit the garden, drawn by the story they've heard from their grandmothers or read about in history books. They ask me what it was like to face such evil, how I found the courage to fight back, whether I was afraid. I always tell them the truth. I was terrified every single day, but I was more afraid of dying without fighting than I was of fighting and possibly losing. And most importantly, I understood that my life wasn't just my own. It belonged to all the women who might come after me, who might fall into the same trap if I didn't find a way to stop the monster who had trapped me. The strength I found in that basement didn't come from nowhere. It came from a lifetime of surviving hardship, from the resilience I had built during years of poverty and loss, from the stubborn determination to keep living even when life seemed impossible. Those experiences hadn't weakened me. They had prepared me for the greatest challenge of my life. Today, when I see young women struggling with difficult situations, I want them to know that their current hardships aren't punishments or signs of weakness. They're training grounds, places where strength is built and character is formed. The skills you learn surviving small evils prepare you to face greater ones when necessary. I also want them to understand that asking for help isn't surrender, it's strategy. Sarah and I succeeded because we worked together, because we refused to let pride or shame prevent us from seeking allies in our fight against evil. The women who died in Cornelius's house died alone, convinced they had no choice but to endure their suffering in silence. The house I live in now, the same boarding house where I lived before my marriage to Cornelius, has been converted into apartments for elderly women who need affordable housing. I chose to return here not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of how far I've traveled and how much I've learned. The desperate 19-year-old girl who once lived in poverty here would be amazed to see what she would become, not wealthy in money, but rich in purpose, surrounded by the respect of her community and the love of the many women whose lives she helped save. Every morning when I wake up in this place where my adult life truly began, I'm reminded that we never know what challenges life will bring us, but we can trust in our ability to meet them. The strength we need is already inside us, waiting to be discovered when circumstances demand it. My name is Betty Morrison, though that's not the name I was born with, or the name I chose for myself. It's the name that was forced on me by a monster who thought he could own me, break me, and ultimately kill me. But I kept that name as a reminder of what I survived and what I learned about my own power. If you're listening to this story and you're facing something that feels impossible, something that makes you believe you're trapped with no way out, I want you to remember what a poor, uneducated girl from Cedar Falls discovered in the darkest moment of her life. You are stronger than your circumstances, braver than your fears, and more capable than you know. And sometimes, when evil thinks it has won, when predators believe they've found the perfect victim, that's exactly when ordinary people find extraordinary strength and change the world in ways that ripple forward through generations. The monsters of this world are counting on you to stay silent, to stay isolated, to believe you're powerless. Prove them wrong.